Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Preface. A Chancery judge once had the kindness to inform me, as one of a company of some 150 men and women, not labouring under any suspicions of lunacy, that the Court of Chancery, though the shining subject of much popular prejudice, at which point I thought the judge's eye had a cast in my direction, was almost immaculate. There had been, he admitted, a trivial blemish or so in its rate of progress, but this was exaggerated, and had been entirely owing to the parsimony of the public, which guilty public, it appeared, had been until lately bent in the most determined manner on by no means enlarging the number of Chancery judges appointed, I believe, by Richard II, but any other king will do as well. This seemed to me too profound a joke to be inserted in the body of this book, or I should have restored it to Conversation Kenge or to Mr. Vholes, with one or other of whom I think it must have originated. In such mouths I might have coupled it with an apt quotation from one of Shakespeare's sonnets: "My nature is subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. Pity me, then, and wish I were renewed." But as it is wholesome that the parsimonious public should know what has been doing, and it still is doing, in this connection, I mention here that everything set forth in these pages concerning the Court of Chancery is substantially true, and within the truth. The case of Gridley is in no essential altered from one of actual occurrence, made public by a disinterested person who was professionally acquainted with the whole of the mysterious wrong from beginning to end. At the present moment, August 1853, there is a suit before the court which was commenced nearly 20 years ago, in which from 30 to 40 counsel have been known to appear at one time, in which costs have been incurred to the amount of £70,000, which is a friendly suit, and which is, I am assured, no nearer to its termination now than when it begun. There is another well-known suit in Chancery, not yet decided, which was commenced before the close of the last century, and in which more than double the amount of £70,000 has been swallowed up in costs. If I wanted other authorities for Jarndyce and Jarndyce, I could rain them on these pages to the shame of a parsimonious public. There is only one other point on which I offer a word of remark. The possibility of what is called spontaneous combustion has been denied since the death of Mr. Crook, and my good friend Mr. Lewis, quite mistaken as he soon found in supposing the thing to have been abandoned by all authorities, published some ingenious letters to me at the time when that event was chronicled, arguing that spontaneous combustion could not possibly be. I have no need to observe that I do not wilfully or negligently mislead my readers, and that before I wrote that description I took pains to investigate the subject. There are about 30 cases on record, of which the most famous, that of the Countess Cornelia de Bodi Cessanate, was minutely investigated and described by Giuseppe Bianchini, a prebendary of Verona, otherwise distinguished in letters, who published an account of it at Verona in 1731, which he afterwards republished at Rome. The appearances, beyond all rational doubt, observed in that case are the appearances observed in Mr. Crook's case. The next most famous incident happened at Rheims 6 years earlier, and the historian in that case is Licquat, one of the most renowned surgeons produced by France. The subject was a woman whose husband was ignorantly convicted of having murdered her, but on solemn appeal to a higher court he was acquitted, because it was shown upon the evidence that she had died the death of which this name of spontaneous combustion is given. I do not think it necessary to add to these notable facts, and that general reference to the authorities which will be found at page 30, volume 2, the recorded opinions and experiences of distinguished medical professors, French, English, and Scotch, in more modern days, contenting myself with observing that I shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable spontaneous combustion of the testimony on which human occurrences are usually received. In Bleak House I have purposely dwelt upon the romantic side of familiar things. 1853. Transcriber's note. This referred to a specific page in the printed book. In this Project Gutenberg edition, The pertinent information is in Chapter 30, paragraph 90. Another case very clearly described by a dentist occurred at the town of Columbus in the United States of America quite recently. The subject was a German who kept a liquor shop and was an inveterate drunkard. Chapter 1. In Chancery. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. And it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs indistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon the crust of mud, sticking at all those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere, fog up the river, where it flows among green apes and meadows, fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city, fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners, wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper, down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may, from the spongy fields, be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there become fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep, to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. On such an afternoon, if ever, the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting here, as here he is, with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog. On such an afternoon some score of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as they here are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless course, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat-hair and horsehair warded heads against walls of words, and making a pretence of equity with the serious faces, as players might. On such an afternoon the various solicitors in the course, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, who made a fortune by it, ought to be, as are they not, ranged in a line, in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, between the registrar's red table and the silk gowns, with bills, cross bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, references to masters, masters' reports, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. Well may the court be dim with wasting candles here and there. Well may the fog hang heavy in it, as if it would never get out. Well may the stained glass windows lose their colour and admit no light of day into the place. Well may the uninitiated from the streets who peep in through the glass panes in the door be deterred from entrance by its owlish aspect, and by the drawl languidly echoing to the roof from the padded dais where the Lord High Chancellor looks into the lantern that has no light in it, and where the attendant wigs are all stuck in a fog bank. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress, borrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearing out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honourable man among its practitioners who would not give, who does not often give, the warning, suffer any wrong that can be done to you, rather than come here. Who happened to be in the Lord Chancellor's court this murky afternoon besides the Lord Chancellor, the counsel in the cause, 2 or 3 counsel who are never in any cause, and the well of solicitors before mentioned? There is the registrar below the judge in wig and gown, and there are 2 or 3 maces, or petty bags, or privy purses, or whatever they may be, in legal court suits. These are all yawning, for no crumb of amusement ever falls from Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the cause in hand, which was squeezed dry years upon years ago. The shorthand writers, the reporters of the court, and the reporters of the newspapers invariably decamp with the rest of the regulars when Jarndyce and Jarndyce comes on. Their places are a blank. Standing on a seat at the side of the hall, the better to peer into the curtained sanctuary, is a little mad old woman in a squeezed bonnet, who is always in court, from its sitting to its rising, and always expecting some incomprehensible judgment to be given in her favour. Some say she really is, or was, a party to a suit, but no one knows for certain, because no one cares. She carries some small litter in a reticule which she calls her documents, principally consisting of paper matches and dry lavender. A sallow prisoner has come up, in custody, for the half-dozenth time to make a personal application to purge himself of his contempt, which, being a solitary surviving executor who has fallen into a state of conglomeration about accounts, of which it is not pretended that he ever had any knowledge, he is not at all likely ever to do. In the meantime his prospects in life are ended. Another ruined suitor, who periodically appears from Shropshire and breaks out into efforts to address the Chancellor at the close of the day's business, and who can by no means made to understand that the Chancellor is legally ignorant of his existence after making it desolate for a quarter of a century. He plants himself in a good place and keeps an eye on the judge, ready to call out "My lord" in a voice of sonorous complaint on the instant of his rising. A few lawyers' clerks, and others who know this suitor by sight, linger on the chance of his furnishing some fun and enlivening the dismal weather a little. Jarndyce and Jarndyce drones on. This scarecrow of a suit has, in course of time, become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand it least, but it has been observed that no 2 Chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause. Innumerable young people have married into it. Innumerable old people have died out of it. Scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit. The little plaintiff or defendant who was promised a new rocking horse when Jarndyce and Jarndyce should be settled has grown up, possessed himself of a real horse, and trotted away into the other world. Fair wards of court have faded into mothers and grandmothers, A long procession of chancellors has come in and gone out. The legion of bills in the suit have been transformed into mere bills of mortality. There are not 3 Jarndyces left upon the earth, perhaps since old Tom Jarndyce, in despair, blew his brains out at a coffee-house in Chancery Lane. But Jarndyce and Jarndyce still drags its dreary length before the court, perennially hopeless. Jarndyce and Jarndyce has passed into a joke. That is the only good that has ever come of it. It has been death to many, but it is a joke in the profession. Every master in Chancery had a reference out of it. Every chancellor was in it for somebody or other when he was a counsel at the bar. Good things have been said about it by blue-nosed, bulbous-shoed old benchers in select port wine committees after dinner in hall. Articled clerks have been in the habit of fleshing their legal wit upon it. The last Lord Chancellor handled it neatly when correcting Mr. Blowers, the eminent silk gown, who said that such a thing might happen when the sky rained potatoes. He observed, or when we get through Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Mr. Blowers, a pleasantry that particularly tickled the maces, bags and purses. How many people out of a suit of Jarndyce and Jarndyce had stretched forth its unwholesome hand to spoil and corrupt would be a very wide question. From the master, upon whose impaling files reams of dusty warrants in Jarndyce and Jarndyce have grimly writhed into many shapes, down to the copying clerk in the Six Clerks' Office, who has copied his tens of thousands of Chancery folio pages under that eternal heading. No man's nature has been made better by it. In trickery, evasion, procrastination, spoliation, botheration, under false pretences of all sorts, there are influences that can never come to good. The very solicitous boys who have kept the wretched suitors at bay, by protesting time out of mind that Mr. Chuzzle, Mizzle, or otherwise, was particularly engaged and had appointments until dinner, may have got an extra moral twist and shuffle into themselves out of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. The receiver in this cause has acquired a goodly sum of money by it, but has acquired too a distrust of his own mother and a contempt for his own kind. Chisel, Mizzle, and otherwise have lapsed into a habit of vaguely promising themselves that they will look into that outstanding little matter and see what can be done for Drizzle, who was not well used. When Jarndyce and Jarndyce shall be got out of the office, shirking and sharking in all their many varieties have been sown broadcast by the ill-fated cause, and even those who have contemplated its history from the outermost circle of such evil have been insensibly tempted into a loose way of letting bad things alone to take their own bad course, and a loose belief that if the world go wrong it was in some kind of off-hand manner never meant to go right. Thus in the midst of the mud, at the heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his court of Chancery. "Mr. Tangle," says the Lord High Chancellor, latterly something restless under the eloquence of that learned gentleman. "My lord," says Mr. Tangle. Mr. Tangle knows more of Jarndyce and Jarndyce than anybody. He is famous for it, supposed never to have read anything else since he left school. "Have you nearly concluded your argument?" "My lord, no. Variety points. Think it my duty to submit, lordship," is the reply that slides out of Mr. Tangle. "Several members of the bar are still to be heard, I believe," says the Chancellor with a slight smile. 18 of Mr. Tangle's learned friends, each armed with a little summary of 1800 sheets, bob up like 18 hammers in a pianoforte, make 18 bows, and drop into their 18 places of obscurity. "We will proceed with the hearing on Wednesday fortnight," says the Chancellor, "for the question at issue is only a question of cost, a mere bud on the forest tree of the parent suit, and really will come to a settlement one of these days." The Chancellor rises, the bar rises, the prisoner is brought forward in a hurry, the man from Shropshire cries, "My lord!" Maces, bags and purses indignantly proclaim silence and frown at the man from Shropshire. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor, still on Jarndyce and Jarndyce, "to the young girl—" "Beg your lordship's pardon, boy," says Mr. Tangle prematurely. "In reference," proceeds the Chancellor with extra distinctness, "to the young girl and boy, the 2 young people," Mr. Tangle crushed, "whom I directed to be in attendance today, and who are now in my private room, I will see them and satisfy myself as to the expediency of making the order for their residing with their uncle, Mr. Tangle, on his legs again, beg your lordship's pardon, dead, with their Chancellor, looking through his double eyeglass at the papers on his desk, grandfather, beg your lordship's pardon, victim of rash action, brains. Suddenly a very little counsel with a terrific bass voice arises, fully inflated in the back settlements of the fog, and says, "Will your lordship allow me? I appear for him. He is a cousin, several times removed. I am not at the moment prepared to inform the court what exact remove he is a cousin, but he is a cousin." Leaving this address, delivered like a sepulchral message, ringing in the rafters of the roof, the very little counsel drops, and the fog knows him no more. Everybody looks for him, nobody can see him. "I will speak with both the young people," says the Chancellor anew, "and satisfy myself on the subject of their residing with their cousin. I will mention the matter to-morrow morning when I take my seat." The Chancellor is about to bow to the bar when the prisoner is presented. Nothing can possibly come of the prisoner's conglomeration but his being sent back to prison, which is soon done. The man from Shropshire ventures another remonstrative "My lord," but the Chancellor, being aware of him, has dexterously vanished. Everybody else quickly vanishes too. A battery of blue bags is loaded with heavy charges of papers and carried off by clerks. The little mad old woman marches off with her documents. The empty court is locked up. If all the injustice it has committed, and all the misery it has caused, could only be locked up with it, and the whole burnt away in a great funeral pyre, why, so much the better for other parties than the parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Chapter 2. In Fashion. It is but a glimpse of the world of fashion that we want on this same miry afternoon. It is not so unlike the Court of Chancery, but that we may pass from the one scene to the other as the crow flies. Both the world of fashion and the Court of Chancery are things of precedent and usage. Oversleeping Rip Van Winkles, who have played at strange games through a deal of thundery weather, sleeping beauties whom the night will wake one day, when all the stop spits in the kitchen shall begin to turn prodigiously. It is not a large world, relatively even to this world of ours, which has its limits too, as your Highness shall find when you have made the tour of it and come back to the brink of the void beyond. It is a very little speck. There is much good in it. There are many good and true people in it. It has its appointed place. But the evil of that is that it is a world wrapped up in too much jewellers' cotton and fine wool, and cannot hear the rushing of the larger worlds, and cannot see them as they circle round the sun. It is a deadened world, and its growth is sometimes unhealthy for want of air. My Lady Dedlock has returned to her house in town for a few days previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. The fashionable intelligence says so for the comforter of the Parisians, and it knows all fashionable things. To know things otherwise were to be unfashionable. My Lady Dedlock has been down at what she calls, in familiar conversation, her place in Lincolnshire. The waters are out in Lincolnshire. An arch of the bridge in the park has been sapped and sopped away. The adjacent low-lying ground for half a mile in breadth is a stagnant river with melancholy trees for islands in it, and a surface punctured all over, all day long, with falling rain. My Lady Dedlock's place has been extremely dreary. The weather for many a day and night has been so wet that the trees seem wet through, and the soft loppings and prunings of the woodsman's axe can make no crash or crackle as they fall. The deer, looking soaked, leave quagmires where they pass. The shot of a rifle loses its sharpness in the moist air, and its smoke moves in a tardy little cloud towards the green rise, coppice-topped, that makes a background for the falling rain. The view from my Lady Dedlock's own windows is alternately a lead-coloured view and a view in Indian ink. The vases on the stone terrace in the foreground catch the rain all day, and the heavy drops fall, drip, 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 upon the broad flagged pavement. called for an old time the Ghost's Walk. All night, on Sundays, the little church in the park is mouldy. The oaken pulpit breaks out into a cold sweat, and there is a general smell and taste as of the ancient Dedlocks in their graves. My Lady Dedlock, who is childless, looking out in the early twilight from her boudoir at a keeper's lodge, and seeing the light of a fire upon the lattice panes, and smoke rising from the chimney, and a child, chased out by a woman, running out into the rain to meet the shining figure of a wrapped-up man coming through the gate, has been quite put out of temper. My Lady Dedlock says she has been bored to death. Therefore my Lady Dedlock has come away from the place in Lincolnshire, and has left it to the rain, and the crows, and the rabbits, and the deer, and the partridges and pheasants. The pictures of the Dedlock past and gone have seemed to have vanished into the damp walls in a mere lowness of spirits, as the housekeeper has passed along the old rooms, shutting up the shutters. And when they will next come forth again, the fashionable intelligence, which, like the fiend, is omniscient of the past and present, but not the future, cannot yet undertake to say. Sir Leicester Dedlock is only a baronet, but there is no mightier baronet than he. His family is as old as the hills, and infinitely more respectable. There is a general opinion of that the world might get on without hills, but would be done up without the Dedlocks. He would on the whole admit nature to be a good idea, a little low perhaps when not enclosed with a park fence, but an idea dependent for its execution on your great country families. He is a gentleman of strict conscience, disdainful of all littleness and meanness, and ready on the shortest notice to die any death you may please to mention rather than give occasion for the least impeachment of his integrity. He is an honourable, obstinate, truthful, high-spirited, intensely prejudiced, perfectly unreasonable man. Sir Leicester is 20 years full measure older than my lady. He will never see 65 again, nor perhaps 66, nor yet 67. He has a twist of the gout now and then, and walks a little stiffly. He is of a worthy presence, with his light grey hair and whiskers, his fine shirt frill, his pure white waistcoat, and his blue coat with bright buttons, always buttoned. He is ceremonious, stately, most polite on every occasion to my lady, and he holds her personal attractions in the highest estimation. His gallantry to my lady, which has never changed since he courted her, is the one little touch of romantic fancy in him. Indeed, he married her for love. A whisper still goes about that she had not even family. Howbeit, Sir Leicester had so much family that perhaps he had had enough and could dispense with any more. But she had beauty, pride, ambition, insolent resolve, and a sense enough to portion out a legion of fine ladies. Wealth and station, added to those, soon floated her upward, and for years now my Lady Dedlock has been at the centre of the fashionable intelligence and at the top of the fashionable tree. How Alexander wept when he had no more worlds to conquer, everybody knows, or has some reason to know by this time, the matter having been rather frequently mentioned. My Lady Dedlock, having conquered her world, fell not into the melting, but rather into the freezing mood. An exhausted composure, a worn-out placidity, an equanimity of fatigue, not to be ruffled by interest or satisfaction, are the trophies of her victory. She is perfectly well bred. If she could be translated to heaven to-morrow, she might be expected to ascend without any rapture. She has beauty still, and if it be not in its heyday, it is not yet in its autumn. She has a fine face, originally of a character that would be rather called very pretty than handsome, but improved into classicality by the acquired expression of her fashionable state. Her figure is elegant, and has the effect of being tall. Not that she is so, but that the most is made, as the Honourable Bob Stables has frequently asserted upon oath, of her points. The same authority observes that she is perfectly got up, and remarks in commendation of her hair, especially that she is the best groomed woman in the whole stud. With all her perfections on her head, my Lady Dedlock has come up from her place in Lincolnshire, hotly pursued by the fashionable intelligence, to pass a few days at her house in town previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. And at her house in town, upon this muddy, murky afternoon, presents himself an old-fashioned gentleman, attorney at law, and eke solicitor of the High Court of Chancery, who has the honour of acting as legal adviser of the Dedlocks, and has many cast-iron boxes in his office with that name outside, as if the present baronet were the coin of the conjurer's trick, and were constantly being juggled through the whole set, across the hall and up the stairs and along the passages and through the rooms, which are very brilliant in the season and very dismal out of it. Fairyland to visit, but a desert to live in. The old gentleman is conducted by a Mercury in powder to my lady's presence. The old gentleman is rusty to look at, but is reputed to have made good thrift out of aristocratic marriage settlements and aristocratic wills, and to be very rich. He is surrounded by a mysterious halo of family confidences, of which he is known to be the silent depositary. There are noble mausoleums rooted for centuries in retired glades of parks among the growing timber and the fern, which perhaps hold fewer noble secrets than walk abroad among men, shut up in the breast of Mr. Tulkinghorn. He is of what is called the old school, a phrase generally meaning any school that seems never to have been young, and wears knee breeches tied with ribbons, and gaiters or stockings. One peculiarity of his black clothes and of his black stockings, be they silk or worsted, is that they never shine. Mute, close, irresponsive to any glancing light, his dress is like himself. He never converses when not professionally consulted. He is found sometimes speechless, but quite at home at corners of dinner tables, in great country houses, and near doors of drawing rooms, concerning which the fashionable intelligence is eloquent, where everybody knows him, and where half the peerage stops to say, "How do you do, Mr. Tulkinghorn?" He receives these salutations with gravity, and buries them along with the rest of his knowledge. Sir Leicester Dedlock is with my lady, and is happy to see Mr. Tulkinghorn. There is an air of prescription about him, which is always agreeable to Sir Leicester. He receives it as a kind of tribute. He likes Mr. Tulkinghorn's dress. There is a kind of tribute in that too. It is eminently respectable, and likewise in a general way retainer-like. It expresses, as it were, the steward of the legal mysteries, the butler of the legal cellar of the Dedlocks. Has Mr. Tulkinghorn any idea of this himself? It may be so, or it may be not. But there is this remarkable circumstance to be noted in everything associated with my Lady Dedlock as one of a class, one of the leaders and representatives of her little world. She supposes herself to be an inscrutable being, quite out of the reach and ken of ordinary mortals. Seeing herself in her glass, where indeed she looks so, yet every dim little star revolving about her, from her maid to the manager of the Italian opera, knows her weaknesses, prejudices, follies, haughtiness, and caprices, and lives upon as accurate a calculation and as nice a measure of her moral nature as a dressmaker takes of her physical proportions. Is a new dress, a new custom, a new singer, a new dancer, a new form of jewellery, a new dwarf or giant, a new chapel, a new anything be set up, there are deferential people in a dozen callings whom my Lady Dedlock suspects of nothing but prostration before her, who can tell you how to manage her as if she were a baby, who do nothing but nurse her all their lives, who, humbly affecting to follow with profound subservience, lead her and her whole troop after them, who, in hooking one, hook all, and bear them off as Lemuel Gulliver bore away the stately fleet of the majestic Lilliput. "If you want to address our people, sir," says Blaze and Sparkle, the jewellers, meaning by our people Lady Dedlock and the rest, "you must remember that you are not dealing with the general public. You must hit our people in their weakest place, and their weakest place is such a place. To make this article go down, gentlemen, say Sheen and Gloss, the mercers, to their friends, the manufacturers, you must come to us, because we know where to have the fashionable people, and we can make it fashionable. If you want to get this print upon the tables of my high connection, sir," says Mr. Sladdery, the librarian, "or if you want to get this dwarf or giant into the houses of my high connection, sir, or if you want to secure to this entertainment the patronage of my high connections, sir, you must leave it, if you please, to me, for I have been accustomed to study the leaders of my high connections, sir, and I may tell you without vanity that I can turn them round my finger, in which Mr. Sladdery, who is an honest man, does not exaggerate at all. Therefore, while Mr. Tulkinghorn may not know what is passing in the Dedlock mind at present, it is very possible that he may. My lady's cause has been again before the Chancellor, has it, Mr. Tulkinghorn? Says Sir Leicester, giving him his hand. Yes, it has been on again to-day, Mr. Tulkinghorn replies, making one of his quiet bows to my lady, who is on a sofa near the fire, shading her face with a hand-screen. It would be useless to ask, says my lady, with the dreariness of the place in Lincolnshire still upon her, whether anything has been done. Nothing that you would call anything has been done to-day, replies Mr. Tulkinghorn. Nor ever will be, says my lady. Sir Leicester has no objection to an interminable chancery suit. It is a slow, expensive, British constitutional kind of thing. To be sure, he has not a vital interest in the suit in question, her part in which was the only property my lady brought him, and he has a shadowy impression that for his name, the name of Dedlock, to be in a cause, and not in the title of that cause, is a most ridiculous accident. But he regards the Court of Chancery, even if it should involve an occasional delay of justice and a trifling amount of confusion, as a something devised in conjunction with a variety of other somethings by the perfection of human wisdom for the eternal settlement, humanly speaking, of everything. And he is, upon the whole, of a fixed opinion that to give the sanction of his countenance to any complaints respecting it would be to encourage some person in the lower classes to rise up somewhere, like Wat Tyler. As a few fresh affidavits have been put upon the file, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, and as they are short, and as I proceed upon the troublesome principle of begging leave to possess my clients with any new proceedings in a cause, cautious man, Mr. Tulkinghorn taking no more responsibility than necessary, and further, as I see you are going to Paris, I have brought them in my pocket. Sir Leicester was going to Paris too, by the by, but the delight of the fashionable intelligence was in his lady. Mr. Tulkinghorn takes out his papers, asks permission to place them on a golden talisman of a table at my lady's elbow, puts on his spectacles, and begins to read by the light of a shaded lamp. In Chancery, between John Jarndyce, my lady interrupts, requesting him to miss as many of the formal horrors as he can. Mr. Tulkinghorn glances over his spectacles and begins again lower down. My lady carelessly and scornfully abstracts her attention. Sir Leicester, in a great chair, looks at the file and appears to have a stately liking for the legal repetitions and prolixities as ranging among the national bullocks. It happens that the fire is hot where my lady sits, and that the hand-screen is more beautiful than useful, being priceless but small. My lady, changing her position, sees the papers on the table, looks at them nearer still, asks impulsively, "Who copied that?" Mr. Tulkinghorn stops short, surprised by my lady's animation and her unusual tone. "Is it what you people call a law hand?" she asks, looking full at him in her careless way, and again toying with her screen. "Not quite, probably." Mr. Tulkinghorn examines it as he speaks. "The legal character which it has was acquired after the original hand was formed." "Why do you ask?" "Anything to vary this detestable monotony. Oh, go on, do." Mr. Tulkinghorn reads again. The heat is greater. My lady screens her face. Sir Leicester dozes, starts up suddenly, and cries, "What do you say?" "I say, I am afraid," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, who has risen hastily, "that Lady Dedlock is ill." "Faint," my lady murmurs with white lips. "Only that, but it is like the faintness of death. Don't speak to me. Ring and take me to my room." Mr. Tulkinghorn retires into another chamber. Bells ring, feet shuffle and patter. Silence ensues. Mercury at last begs Mr. Tulkinghorn to return. "Better now," quoth Sir Leicester, motioning the lawyer to sit down and read to him alone. "I have been quite alarmed. I never knew my lady swoon before. But the weather is extremely trying, and she really has been bored to death down at our place in Lincolnshire." Chapter 3. In progress. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, for I know I am not clever. I always knew that. I can remember when I was a very little girl indeed. I used to say to my doll when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I am not clever, you know very well, and you must be patient with me, like a dear." And so she used to sit propped up in a great armchair, with her beautiful complexion and rosy lips staring at me, or not so much at me, I think, as at nothing, while I busily stitched away and told her every one of my secrets. My dear old doll! It was such a shiny little thing that I seldom dared to open my lips, and I never dared to open my heart to anybody else. It almost makes me cry to think what a relief it used to be to me when I came home from school of a day to run upstairs to my room and say, "Oh, you dear, faithful Dolly, I knew you would be expecting me," and then to sit down on the floor, leaning on the elbow of her great chair, and tell her all I had noticed since we parted. I had always rather a noticing way, not a quick way, oh no, a silent way of noticing what passed before me, and thinking I should like to understand it better. I have not by any means a quick understanding. When I love a person very tenderly indeed, it seems to brighten, but even that may be my vanity. I was brought up from my earliest remembrance like some of the princesses in the fairy stories, only I was not charming, by my godmother. At least, I only knew her as such. She was a good, good woman. She went to church 3 times every Sunday, and to morning prayers on Wednesdays and Fridays, and to lectures whenever there were lectures, and never missed. She was handsome, and if she had ever smiled would have been, I used to think, like an angel. But she never smiled. She was always grave and strict. She was so very good herself, I thought that the badness of other people made her frown all her life. I felt so different from her, even making every allowance for the differences between a child and a woman. I felt so poor, so trifling, and so far off that I never could be unrestrained with her. No, could never even love her as I had wished. It made me very sorry to consider how good she was and how unworthy of her I was, and I used to ardently hope that I might have a better heart, and I talked it over very often with the clear old doll. But I never loved my godmother as I ought to have loved her, and as I felt I must have loved her if I had been a better girl. This made me, I dare say, more timid and retiring than I naturally was, and cast me upon Dolly as the only friend with whom I felt at ease. But something happened when I was still quite a little thing that helped it very much. I had never heard of my mamma spoken of. I had never heard of my papa either, but I felt more interested about my name. I had never worn a black frock that I could recollect. I had never been shown my mamma's grave. I had never been told where it was. Yet I had never been taught to pray for any relation but my godmother. I had more than once approached this subject of my thoughts with Mrs. Rachel, our only servant, who took my light away when I was in bed, another very good woman, but austere to me, and she had only said, "Esther, good night," and gone away and left me. Although there were 7 girls at the neighbouring school where I was a day boarder, and although they called me little Esther Summerson, I knew none of them at home. All of them were older than I, to be sure. I was the youngest there by a good deal, but there seemed to be some other separation between us, besides that, and besides their being far more clever than I was, and knowing much more than I did. One of them, in the first week of my going to the school, I remember it very well, invited me home to a little party, to my great joy, but my godmother wrote a stiff letter declining for me. It was my birthday. There were holidays at school on other birthdays, none on mine. There were rejoicings at home on other birthdays, as far as I knew from what I heard the girls relate to one another. There were none on mine. My birthday was the most melancholy day at home in the whole year. I have mentioned that unless my vanity should deceive me, as I know it may, for I may be very vain without suspecting it, though indeed I don't, my comprehension is quickened when my affection is. My disposition is very affectionate, and perhaps I might still feel such a wound, if such a wound could be received more than once, with the quickness of that birthday. Dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. The clock ticked, the fire clicked. Not another sound had been heard in the room or in the house for I don't know how long. I happened to look timidly up from my stitching across the table at my godmother, and I saw in her face, looking gloomily at me, "It would have been far better, little Esther, that you had no birthday, that you had never been born." I broke out crying and sobbing, and said, "Oh, dear godmother, tell me, pray do tell me, did mamma die on my birthday?" "No," she returned. "Ask me no more, child." "Oh, pray do tell me something of her. Do now at last, dear godmother, if you please. What did I do to her? How did I lose her? Why am I so different from other children? And why is it my fault, dear godmother? No, 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 don't go away. Oh, speak to me." I was in a kind of fright beyond my grief, and I caught hold of her dress and was kneeling to her. She had been saying all the while, "Let me go," but now she stood still. Her darkened face had such power over me that it stopped me in the midst of my vehemence. I put up my trembling little hand to clasp hers, or to beg her pardon, with what earnestness I might, but withdrew it as soon as she looked at me, and laid it on my fluttering heart. She raised me, sat in her chair, and standing me before her, said slowly, in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can. I have forgiven her." But her face did not relent. "The wrong she did to me, and I say no more of it, though it was greater than you will ever know, than any one will ever know. But I, the sufferer, for yourself, unfortunate girl, orphaned and degraded from the first of these evil anniversaries, pray daily that the sins of the others be not visited upon your head, according to what is written. Forget your mother, and leave all other people to forget her who will do her unhappy child that greatest kindness. Now go." She checked me, however, as I was about to depart from her, so frozen as I was, and added this, "Submission, self-denial, diligent work are the preparations for a life begun with such a shadow on it. You are different from other children, Esther, because you were not born like them in common sinfulness and wrath. You are set apart." I went up to my room and crept to bed, and laid my doll's cheek against mine, wet with tears, and holding that solitary friend upon my bosom, cried myself to sleep. Imperfect as my understanding of my sorrow was, I knew that I had brought no joy at any time to anybody's heart, and that I was to no one upon earth what Dolly was to me. Dear, dear, to think how much time we passed alone together afterwards, and how often I repeated to the doll the story of my birthday, and confided to her that I would try as hard as I ever could to repair the fault I had been born with, of which I confessedly felt guilty and yet innocent, and would strive as I grew up to be industrious, contented, and kind-hearted, and to do some good to someone, and win some love to myself if I could. I hope it's not self-indulgent to shed these tears as I think of it. I am very thankful, I am very cheerful, but I cannot quite help their coming to my eyes. There, I've wiped them away now, and can go on again properly. I felt the distance between my godmother and myself so much more after the birthday, and felt so sensible of filling a place in her house which ought to have been empty, that I found her more difficult of approach, though I was fervently grateful to her in my heart than ever. I felt the same way towards my school companions. I felt in the same way towards Mrs. Rachel, who was a widow, and, towards her daughter, of whom she was proud, who came to see her once a fortnight. I was very retired and quiet, and tried to be very diligent. One sunny afternoon, when I had come home from school with my books and portfolio, watching my long shadow at my side, and as I was gliding upstairs to my room as usual, my godmother looked out of the parlour door and called me back. Sitting with her I found, which was very unusual indeed, a stranger, a portly, important-looking gentleman, dressed all in black, with a white cravat, large gold watch seals, a pair of gold eyeglasses, and a large seal ring upon his little finger. "This," said my godmother in an undertone, "is the child." Then she said, in her naturally stern way of speaking, "This is Esther, sir." The gentleman put up his eyeglasses to look at me and said, "Come here, my dear." He shook hands with me and asked me to take off my bonnet, looking at me all the while. When I had complied, he said, "Ah," and afterwards, "Yes." And then, taking off his eyeglasses and folding them in a red case, and leaning back in his armchair, turning the case about in his two hands, he gave my godmother a nod. Upon that my godmother said, "You may go upstairs, Esther," and I made him my curtsy and left him. It must have been 2 years afterwards, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud, and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her. I was reading from St. John, how our Saviour stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted himself up and said unto them, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head, and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book, "Watch ye therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch." In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. I had no need to cry out. Her voice had sounded through the house and had been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered outwardly, with her old, handsome, resolute frown that I so well knew carved upon her face. Many and many a time, in the day and in the night, with my head upon the pillow by her, that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, no, no. Her face was immovable. To the very last, and even afterwards, her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor good godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth appeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel, and found him in the same place as if he had never gone away. "My name is Kenge," he said. "You may remember it, my child. Kenge and Carboy, Lincoln's Inn." I replied that I remembered to have seen him once before. "Pray be seated here near me. Don't distress yourself. It's of no use. Mrs. Rachel, I needn't inform you, who were acquainted with the late Miss Barbary's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt is dead—" "My aunt, sir?" "It is really of no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it," said Mr. Kenge smoothly. "Aunt in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself, don't weep, don't tremble. Mrs. Rachel, our young friend, has no doubt heard of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce." "Never," said Mrs. Rachel. "Is it possible," pursued Mr. Kenge, putting up his eyeglasses, "that our young friend, I beg you don't distress yourself, never heard of Jarndyce and Jarndyce?" I shook my head, wondering even what it was. "Not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce," said Mr. Kenge, looking over his glasses at me, and softly turning the case about and about as if he were petting something. "Not one of the greatest chancery suits known? Not of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, the in itself a monument of chancery practice, in which, I would say, every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again? It is a cause that could not exist out of this free and great country. I should say that the aggregate of costs in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Mrs. Rachel," I was afraid he addressed himself to her because I appeared inattentive, "amounts at the present hour from 60 to 70,000 pounds," said Mr. Kenge, leaning back in his chair. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was so entirely unacquainted with the subject that I understood nothing about it even then. "And she really never heard of the cause?" said Mr. Kenge. "Surprising." "Miss Barbary, sir," returned Mrs. Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. "I hope so, I am sure," said Mr. Kenge politely. "Wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows, from any teaching she has had here, nothing more." "Well," said Mr. Kenge, "upon the whole, very proper. Now to the point," addressing me. "Miss Barbary, your sole relation, in fact that is, for I am bound to observe that in law you had none, being deceased, and it naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel—" "Oh dear no," said Mrs. Rachel quickly. "Quite so," assented Mr. Kenge, "that Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support. I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Miss Barbary some 2 years ago, and which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I avow that I represent in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and otherwise, a highly humane but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution?" said Mr. Kenge, leaning back in his chair again and looking calmly at us both. He appeared to enjoy beyond everything the sound of his own voice. I couldn't wonder at that, for it was mellow and full, and gave great importance to every word he uttered. He listened to himself with obvious satisfaction, and sometimes gently beat time to his own music with his head, or rounded a sentence with his hand. I was very much impressed by him even then, before I knew that he formed himself on the model of a great lord who was his client, and that he was generally called Conversation Kenge. "Mr. Jarndyce," he pursued, "being aware of the, I would say, desolate position of our young friend, offers to place her at a first-rate establishment where her education shall be completed, where her comfort shall be secured, where her reasonable wants shall be anticipated, where she shall be eminently qualified to discharge her duty in that station of life unto which it has pleased, shall I say Providence, to call her." My heart was filled so full both by what he said and by his affecting manner of saying it, that I was not able to speak, though I tried. "Mr. Jarndyce," he went on, "makes no condition beyond expressing his expectation that our young friend will not at any time remove herself from the establishment in question without his knowledge and concurrence; that she will faithfully apply herself to the acquisition of those accomplishments upon the exercise of which she will be ultimately dependent; that she will tread in the paths of virtue and honour, and so forth. I was still less able to speak than before. "Now what does our young friend say?" proceeded Mr. Kenge. "Take time, take time." I paused for her reply, but take time. What the destitute subject of such an offer tried to say I need not repeat. What she did say I could more easily tell if it were worth the telling. What she felt and will feel to her dying hour I could never relate. This interview took place at Windsor, where I had passed, as far as I knew, my whole life. On that day week, amply provided with all necessaries, I left it inside the stagecoach for Reading. Mrs. Rachel was too good to feel any emotion at parting, but I was not so good, and wept bitterly. I thought that I ought to have known her better after so many years, and ought to have made myself enough of a favourite with her to make her sorry then. When she gave me one cold parting kiss upon my forehead, like a thaw drop from the stone porch, it was a very frosty day. I felt so miserable and self-reproachful that I clung to her and told her it was my fault. I knew that she could say good-bye so easily. "No, Esther," she returned, "it is your misfortune." The coach was at the little lawn gate. We had not come out until we heard the wheels, and thus I left her with a sorrowful heart. She went in before my boxes were lifted on to the coach roof, and shut the door. As long as I could see the house, I looked back at it from the window through my tears. My godmother had left Mrs. Rachel all the little property she possessed, and there was to be a sail, and an old hearthrug with roses on it, which always seemed to me the first thing in the world I had ever seen, was hanging outside in the frost and snow. A day or two before, I had wrapped the dear old doll in her own shawl and quietly laid her, I am half ashamed to tell it, in the garden earth under the tree that shaded my old window. I had no companion left but my bird, and him I carried with me in his cage. When the house was out of sight, I sat with my bird cage in the straw at my feet, forward on the low seat to look out of the high window, watching the frosty trees that were like beautiful pieces of spar, and the fields all smooth and white with last night's snow, and the sun so red but yielding so little heat, and the ice dark like metal where the skaters and sliders had brushed the snow away. There was a gentleman in the coach who sat on the opposite seat and looked very large in a quantity of wrappings, but he sat gazing out of the other window and took no notice of me. I thought of my dead godmother, of the night when I had read to her, of her frowning so fixedly and sternly in her bed, of the strange place I was going to, of the people I should find there and what they would be like, and what would they say to me, when a voice in the coach gave me a terrible start. It said, "What the devil are you crying for?" I was so frightened that I lost my voice and could only answer in a whisper, "Me, sir?" For of course I knew that it must have been the gentleman in the quantity of wrappings, though he was still looking out of his window. "Yes, you," he said, turning round. "I didn't know I was crying, sir," I faltered. "But you are," said the gentleman. "Look here." He came quite opposite to me from the other corner of the coach, brushed one of his large furry cuffs across my eyes, but without hurting me, and showed me that it was wet. "There, now you know you are," he said, "don't you?" "Yes, sir," I said. "And what are you crying for?" said the gentleman. "Do you want to go there?" "Where, sir?" "Where? Why, wherever you're going," said the gentleman. "I'm very glad to go there, sir," I answered. "Well, then, look glad," said the gentleman. I thought he was very strange, or at least that what I could see of him was very strange, for he was wrapped up to the chin, and his face was almost hidden in a fur cap with broad fur straps at the side of his head, fastened under his chin. But I was composed again, and not afraid of him. So I told him that I thought I must have been crying because of my godmother's death, and because of Mrs. Rachel's not being sorry to part. "Found Mrs. Rachel," said the gentleman. "Let her fly away in a high wind on a broomstick." I began to be really afraid of him now, and looked at him with the greatest astonishment. But I thought that he had pleasant eyes, although he kept on muttering to himself in an angry manner, and calling Mrs. Rachel names. After a little while he opened his outer wrapper, which appeared to me large enough to wrap up the whole coach, and put his arm down into a deep pocket in the side. "Now look here," he said. "In this paper," which was nicely folded, "is a piece of the best plum cake that could be got for money. Sugar on the outside an inch thick, like fat on mutton chops. Here's a little pie. A gem this is, both for size and quality. Made in France. And what do you suppose it's made of? Livers of fat geese. There's a pie. Now let's see you eat 'em." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Thank you very much indeed, but I hope you won't be offended. They are too rich for me." "Floored again," said the gentleman, which I didn't at all understand, and threw them both out of the window. He did not speak to me any more until he got out of the coach a little way short of Reading, when he advised me to be a good girl and to be studious, and shook hands with me. I must say I was relieved by his departure. We left him at a milestone. I often walked past it afterwards, and never for a long time without thinking of him and half expecting to meet him. But I never did, and so as time went on he passed out of my mind. When the coach stopped, a very neat lady looked up at the window and said, "Miss Donny?" "No, ma'am, Esther Summerson." "That is quite right," said the lady, "Miss Donny." I now understood that she introduced herself by that name, and begged Miss Donny's pardon for my mistake, and pointed out my boxes at her request. Under the direction of a very neat maid, they were put outside a very small green carriage, and then Miss Donny, the maid, and I got inside and were driven away. "Everything is ready for you, Esther," said Miss Donny, "and the scheme of your pursuits has been arranged in exact accordance with the wishes of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce." "Of, did you say, ma'am?" "Of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce," said Miss Donny. I was so bewildered that Miss Donny thought the cold had been too severe for me, and lent me her smelling bottle. "Do you know my guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, ma'am?" I asked, after a good deal of hesitation. "Not personally, Esther," said Miss Donny. "Merely through his solicitors, Messrs. Kenge and Carboy of London. A very superior gentleman, Mr. Kenge, truly eloquent indeed. Some of his periods are quite majestic." I felt this to be very true, but was too confused to attend to it. Our speedy arrival at our destination, before I had time to recover myself, increased my confusion, and I shall never forget the uncertain and unreal of everything at Greenleaf, Miss Donny's house, that afternoon. But I soon became used to it. I was so adapted to the routine of Greenleaf before long that I seemed to have been there a great while, and almost to have dreamed rather than really lived my old life at my godmother's. Nothing could be more precise, exact, and orderly than Greenleaf. There was a time for everything, all round the dial of the clock, and everything was done at its appointed moment. We were 12 boarders, and there were 2 Miss Donnys, twins. It was understood that I would have to depend by and by on my qualifications as a governess, and I was not only instructed in everything that was taught at Greenleaf, but was very soon engaged in helping to instruct others. Although I was treated in every other respect like the rest of the school, this single difference was made in my case from the first. As I began to know more, I taught more, and so in course of time I had plenty to do, which I was very fond of doing because it made the dear girls fond of me. At last, whenever a new pupil came who was a little downcast and unhappy, she was so sure, indeed I don't know why, to make a friend of me, that all newcomers were confided to my care. They said I was so gentle, but I am sure they were. I often thought of the resolution I had made on my birthday to try and be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do some good to someone and win some love if I could. And indeed, I felt almost ashamed to have done so little and to have won so much. I passed at Greenleaf 6 happy, quiet years. I never saw in any face there, thank heaven, on my birthday, that it would have been better if I had never been born. When the day came round, it brought me so many tokens of affectionate remembrance that my room was beautiful with them from New Year's Day to Christmas. In those 6 years I had never been away except on visits at holiday time in the neighbourhood. After the first 6 months or so I had taken Miss Donny's advice in reference to the propriety of writing to Mr. Kenge to say that I was happy and grateful, and with her approval I had written such a letter. I had received a formal answer, acknowledging its receipt and saying, "We note the contents thereof, which shall be duly communicated to our client." After that I sometimes heard Miss Donny and her sister mention how regular my accounts were paid, and how about twice a year I ventured to write a similar letter. I always received by return of post exactly the same answer, in the same round hand, with the signature of Kenge and Carboy in another writing, which I supposed to be Mr. Kenge's. It seemed so curious to me to be obliged to write all this about myself, as if this narrative were the narrative of my life. But my little body will soon fall into the background now. 6 quiet years. I find I am saying it for the second time. I had passed at Greenleaf, seeing in those around me, as it might be in a looking-glass, every stage of my own growth and change there, when, one November morning, I received this letter. I omit the date. Old Square, Lincoln's Inn. Madam, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Our client, Mr. Jarndyce, being about to receive into his house, under an order of the Court of Chancery, a ward of the court in this cause, for whom he wishes to secure an eligible companion, directs us to inform you that he will be glad of your services in the aforesaid capacity. We have arranged for your being forwarded, carriage free, pre-8 o'clock coach, from Reading on Monday morning next, to White House Cellar, Piccadilly, London, where one of our clerks will be in waiting to convey you to our office as above. We are, madam, your obedient servants, Kenge and Carboy. Miss Esther Summerson. Oh, never, never, never shall I forget the emotion this letter caused in the house. It was so tender in them to care so much for me. It was so gracious in that father who had not forgotten me to have made my orphan way so smooth and easy, and to have inclined so many youthful natures towards me, that I could hardly bear it. Not that I would have had them less sorry, I am afraid not, but the pleasure of it, and the pain of it, and the pride and joy of it, and the humble regret of it, was so blended that my heart seemed almost breaking while it was full of rapture. The letter gave me only 5 days' notice of my removal, when every minute added to the proofs of love and kindness that were given me in those 5 days, and when at last the morning came, and when they took me through all the rooms that I might see them for the last time, and when some cried, "Esther, dear, say good-bye to me here at my bedside, where you first spoke so kindly to me," and when others asked me only to write their names with Esther's love, and when they all surrounded me with their parting presents and clung to me, weeping, and cried, "What shall we do when dear, dear Esther's gone?" And when I tried to tell them how forbearing and how good they had all been to me, and how I blessed and thanked them every one, what a heart I had! And when the two Miss Donnies grieved as much to part with me as the least among them, and when the maid said, "Bless you, miss, wherever you go," and when an ugly, lame old gardener, who I thought had hardly noticed me at all in those years, came panting after the coach to give me a little nosegay of geraniums, and told me I had been the light of his eyes. Indeed, the old man said so. What a heart I had then! And could I help it if with all this, the coming to the little school, and the unexpected sight of the poor children outside waving their hats and bonnets to me, and of a grey-haired gentleman and lady whose daughter I had helped to teach, and at whose house I had visited, who were said to be the proudest people in all that county, caring for nothing but calling out, "Good-bye, Esther, may you be very happy," could I help it if I was quite bowed down in the coach by myself, and said, "Oh, I am so thankful, I am so thankful," many times over? But of course I soon considered that I must not take tears where I was going after all that had been done for me. Therefore, of course, I made myself sob less, and persuaded myself to be quiet by saying very often, "Esther, now you really must. This will not do." I cheered myself up pretty well at last, though I am afraid I was longer about it than I ought to have been. And when I had cooled my eyes with lavender water, it was time to watch for London. I was quite persuaded that we were there when we were 10 miles off, and when we were really there, that we should never get there. However, when we began to jolt upon a stone pavement, and particularly when every other conveyance seemed to be running into us, and we seemed to be running into every other conveyance, I began to believe that we really were approaching the end of our journey. Very soon afterwards we stopped. A young gentleman, who had inked himself by accident, addressed me from the pavement and said, "I am from Kenge and Carboys, miss, of Lincoln's Inn." "If you please, sir," said I. He was very obliging, and as he handed me into a fly, after superintending the removal of my boxes, I asked him whether there was a great fire anywhere, for the streets were so full of dense brown smoke that scarcely anything was to be seen. "Oh dear, no, miss," he said. "This is a London particular." I had never heard of such a thing. "A fog, miss," said the young gentleman. "Oh, indeed," said I. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how the people kept their senses, until we passed into a sudden quietude under an old gateway, and drove on through a silent square, until we came to an odd nook in the corner, where there was an entrance up a steep, broad flight of stairs, like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard outside, under some cloisters, for I saw a gravestone from the staircase window. This was Kenge and Carboys. The young gentleman showed me through an outer office into Mr. Kenge's room. There was no one in it, and politely put an armchair for me by the fire. He then called my attention to a little looking-glass hanging from a nail on one side of the chimney-piece. "In case you should wish to look at yourself, miss, after the journey, as you're going before the Chancellor. Not that it's requisite, I'm sure," said the young gentleman civilly. "Going before the Chancellor?" I said, startled for a moment. "Only a matter of form, miss," returned the young gentleman. "Mr. Kenge is in court now. He left his compliments, and would you partake of some refreshment?" There were biscuits and a decanter of wine on a small table. "And look over the paper," which the young gentleman gave me as he spoke. He then stirred the fire and left me. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, candles burning with a white flame and looking raw and cold, that I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant, and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. As it was of no use going on in that way, I put the paper down, took a peep at my bonnet in the glass to see if it was neat, and looked at the room, which was not half lighted, and at the shabby dusty tables, and at the piles of writing, and at a bookcase full of the most inexpressive looking books that ever had anything to say for themselves. Then I went on thinking, and the fire went out. burning, 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 and the candles went on flickering and guttering, and there were no snuffers, until the young gentleman by and by brought a very dirty pair for 2 hours. At last Mr. Kenge came. He was not altered, but he was surprised to see how altered I was, and appeared quite pleased. "As you are going to be the companion of the young lady who is now in the Chancellor's private room, Miss Summerson," he said, "we thought it well that you should be in attendance also. You will not be discomposed by the Lord Chancellor, I dare say." "No, sir," I said, "I don't think I shall, really not seeing on consideration why I should be." So Mr. Kenge gave me his arm, and we went round the corner under a colonnade and in at a side door, and so we came along a passage into a comfortable sort of room, where a young lady and a young gentleman were standing near a great loud roaring fire. A screen was interposed between them and it, and they were leaning on the screen talking. They both looked up when I came in, and I saw in the young lady, with the fire shining upon her, such a beautiful girl, with such rich golden hair, such soft blue eyes, and such a bright, innocent, trusting face. "Miss Ada," said Mr. Kenge, "this is Miss Summerson." She came to meet me with a smile of welcome and her hand extended, but seemed to change her mind in a moment and kiss me. In short, she had such a natural, captivating, winning manner that in a few minutes we were sitting in the window seat with the light of the fire upon us, talking together as free and happy as could be. What a load off my mind! It was so delightful to know that she could confide in me and like me. It was so good of her, and so encouraging to me. The young gentleman was her distant cousin, she told me, and his name Richard Carstone. He was a handsome youth with an ingenious face and a most engaging laugh, and after she had called him up to where we sat, he stood by us in the light of the fire, talking gaily, like a light-hearted boy. He was very young, not more than 19 then, if quite so much, but nearly 2 years older than she was. They were both orphans, and, what was very unexpected and curious to me, had never met before that day. Our all three coming together for the first time in such an unusual place was a thing to talk about, and we talked about it, and the fire, which had left off roaring, winked its red eyes at us, as Richard said, like a drowsy old chancery lion. We conversed in a low tone, because a full-dressed gentleman in a bag-wig frequently came in and out, and when he did so we could hear a drawling sound in the distance, which he said was one of the counsel in our case, addressing the Lord Chancellor. He told Mr. Kenge that the Chancellor would be up in 5 minutes, and presently we heard a bustle and a tread of feet, and Mr. Kenge said that the court had risen, and his lordship was in the next room. The gentleman in the bag-wig opened the door almost directly, and requested Mr. Kenge to come in. Upon that we all went into the next room, Mr. Kenge first, with my darling. It is so natural to me now that I can't help writing it. And there, plainly dressed in black, and sitting in an armchair at a table near the fire, was his lordship, whose robe, trimmed with beautiful gold lace, was thrown upon another chair. He gave us a searching look as we entered, but his manner was both courtly and kind. The gentleman in the bag-wig laid bundles of papers on his lordship's table, and his lordship silently selected one and turned over the leaves. "Miss Clare," said the Lord Chancellor. "Miss Ada Clare." Mr. Kenge presented her, and his lordship begged her to sit down near him. That he admired her and was interested by her, even I could see in a moment. It touched me that the home of such a beautiful young creature should be represented by that dry official place. The Lord High Chancellor, at his best, appeared so poor a substitute for the love and pride of parents. "The Jarndyce in question," said the Lord Chancellor, still turning over leaves, "is Jarndyce of Bleak House." "Jarndyce of Bleak House, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. "A dreary name," said the Lord Chancellor. "But not a dreary place at present, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. "And Bleak House," said his lordship, "is in Hertfordshire, my lord." "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House is not married," said his lordship. "He is not, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. A pause. "Young Mr. Richard Carstone is present," said the Lord Chancellor, glancing towards him. Richard bowed and stepped forward. Said the Lord Chancellor, turning over more leaves. "Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, my lord," Mr. Kenge observed in a low voice, if I may venture to remind your lordship, provides a suitable companion for Mr. Richard Carstone, I thought, but I am not quite sure. I heard his lordship say in an equally low voice and with a smile, for Miss Ada Clare. This is the young lady, Miss Summerson. His lordship gave me an indulgent look and acknowledged my curtsy very graciously. Miss Summerson is not related to any party in the cause, I think? No, my lord. Mr. Kenge leant over before it was quite said, and whispered. His lordship, with his eyes upon his papers, listened, nodded twice or thrice, turned over more leaves, and did not look towards me again until we were going away. Mr. Kenge now retired, and Richard with him, to where I was near the door, leaving my pet, it's so natural to me again that I can't help it, sitting near the Lord Chancellor, with whom his lordship spoke a little part, asking her, as she told me afterwards, whether she had well reflected on the proposed arrangement, if she thought she would be happy under the roof of Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, and why she thought so. Presently he rose courteously and released her, and then he spoke for a minute or two with Richard Carstone, not seated but standing, and altogether with more ease and less ceremony, as if he still knew, though he was Lord Chancellor, how to go straight to the candour of a boy. "Very well," said his lordship aloud. "I shall make the order. Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House has chosen, so far as I may judge," and this was when he looked at me, "a very good companion for the young lady, and the arrangement altogether seems to be the best of which the circumstances admit." He dismissed us pleasantly, and we all went out, very much obliged to him for being so affable and polite, by which he had certainly lost no dignity, but seemed to us to have gained some. When we got under the colonnade, Mr. Kenge remembered that he must go back for a moment to ask a question, and left us in the fog, with the Lord Chancellor's carriage and servants waiting for him to come out. "Well," said Richard Carstone, "that's over. And where do we go next, Miss Summerson?" "Don't you know?" I said. "Not in the least," said he. "And don't you know, my love?" I asked Ada. "No," she said. "Don't you?" "Not at all," said I. We looked at one another, half laughing at our being like children in the wood, when a curious little old woman in a squeezed bonnet and carrying a reticule came curtsying and smiling up to us with an air of great ceremony. "Oh," she said, "the wards in Jarndyce. Very happy, I am sure, to have the honour. It is a good omen for youth and hope and beauty when they find themselves in this place and don't know what's to come of it." "Mad," whispered Richard, not thinking she could hear him. "Right, mad, young gentleman," she returned so quickly that he was quite abashed. "I was a ward myself. I was not mad at that time." Curtsying low and smiling between every little sentence, "I had youth and hope, I believe, beauty. It matters very little now. Neither of the three served or saved me. I have the honour to attend court regularly with my documents. I expect a judgment shortly. On the day of judgment I have discovered that the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelations is the Great Seal. It has been open a long time. Pray accept my blessing." As Ada was a little frightened, I said, to humour the poor old lady, that we were much obliged to her. "Yes," she said mincingly, "I imagine so. And here is Conversation Kenge with his documents. How does your honourable worship do?" "Quite well, quite well. Now don't be troublesome, there's a good soul," said Mr. Kenge, leading the way back. "By no means," said the poor old lady, keeping up with Ada and me. "Anything but troublesome. I shall confer estates on both, which is not being troublesome, I trust. I expect a judgment shortly. On the day of judgment. This is a good omen for you. Accept my blessing." She stopped at the bottom of the steep, broad flight of stairs, but we looked back as we went up, and she was still there, saying with a curtsy and a smile between every little sentence, "Youth and hope, and beauty, and chancery, and conversation Kenge. Ha! Pray accept my blessing."